And today we're gonna end our first session about materials life cycle and craft practicals. And we're gonna start also with our second session about landscape infrastructure and urban reuse. We're going to start today's session by with the work of Gabriella Spada from Sapienza University of Rome, and which is like nothing goes to waste, the use of wood byproduct in the administrative economy of Ur3 and Ebla. So please, Gabriella.
Thank you, Giada. Now I share my presentation. Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
In this paper, I explore how wool byproducts, meaning low-grade fibers and coarse textiles, were managed within two major administrative economies of the third millennium BC. The Ur3 dynasty in southern Mesopotamia and the palace economy of Ebla in northern Syria. Although Ebla predates Ur3 by a couple of centuries, I will begin with the Mesopotamian case. This is because the Ur3 documentation offers a more detailed view of the production process itself, especially the technical management of wool, providing a useful starting point for understanding how byproducts were handled. I will then turn to Ebla, where the perspective is different. There, the focus shifts from production to distribution, but it is still clear that the resources were managed efficiently. What I would like to show today is that even poorer quality fibers, unsuitable for fine textiles, were never wasted. They were systematically integrated into institutional workflows and used to produce specific categories of textiles. In both Ur3, Mesopotamia, and Ebla, wool was a key economic asset, central not only to textile production, but also to financial planning and redistribution. Lower grade fibers were not discarded. They were carefully tracked, weighed, and allocated to basic textiles, often destined for workers, entertainers, and the lower ranking personnel. Importantly, I do not refer to reuse in the strict sense. The byproducts I will be discussing had never been used before. They were simply of lower quality. They often emerged as residual material from combing and plucking. These fibers were typically short, tangled, or irregular, and therefore unfit for luxury production. Let us turn to Mesopotamia, and in particular to the Ur3 period, where wool processing was highly sophisticated and tightly controlled by central institutions. One of the key stages in the production process was combing. This step served to align the fibers and eliminate those that were too short or of poor quality. The waste generated during this refining process was called siki-mug in Sumerian. The term siki means wool, while mug conveys the idea of something weak or of poor quality. In this context, siki-mug designates wool fibers set aside during the preparation of the raw material, fibers considered unsuitable for high-quality spinning, but still available for other types of textile production. In Akkadian, the equivalent term is muku, glossed in the dictionary as wool waste. Another related term, nukaru, corresponding to Sumerian siki-mug hul, occurs only in lexical lists and seems to designate a different kind of inferior wool. Despite their inferior quality, these byproducts were not discarded, quite the opposite. They were reintegrated into the production cycle and used for specific categories of textiles. In fact, the documentation suggests that combing waste was a substantial portion of the total wool processed. One particularly informative example comes from a tablet found at Tumma, dated to the period after the 8th regnal year of King Amarsueno. The text records the weighing of raw wool and the calculation of the textiles to be produced, while also noting the quantities set aside as combing waste and as production loss. Based on this tablet, the finished product accounts for roughly 67% of the original raw wool. The combing waste represents 23%, while production loss accounts for 10%. These proportions are not unique. Wetzold, in his 1972 book, calculated similar figures from other tablets found at Tumma. In these texts, dated to Amarsuena II and III, we again find the Sikimug and the Idzigu, that is the loss, hovering around 23 to 24% and 10% respectively. Further textual evidence reveals an even more refined classification of wool. One document explicitly distinguishes Sikigula, selected wool, from Sikimug. This tells us that not all combing waste was of the same quality. This text describes the production of 3 types of textiles. For each, it records the weight of the finished product, the waste, and the loss. In the higher grade textile, most of the wool becomes textiles, while a smaller part is recorded as Sikimug and Idzigu. In the lower grade textiles, however, yields drop and the amount of Sikimug rises sharply. At the same time, Sikigula, the selected, decreases steadily and eventually disappears in the lowest quality textile. This pattern shows that Sikigula was still a byproduct of combing, but one consisting of better fibers. These could be separated from the coarser Sikimug and used for medium quality textiles. In the lowest grades, by contrast, only coarse waste remained. These records demonstrated the scribes' ability to evaluate wool quality with great precision. Even within waste, they recognized subgrades and allocated them to the most suitable kinds of textiles. In short, the system was highly rationalized, designed to maximize the use of every part of the raw material, even those fibers that at first seemed inferior. Let us now look more closely at what happened to the wool discarded during combing. As we have seen, this lower quality material was reclassified and reintegrated into the textile cycle, but as raw material and as finished textiles. According to Wetzold, it could also be distributed as rations or gifts, usually to groups not engaged in house status activities. These included weavers, as well as children, elderly people, and women employed in other productive sectors, such as oil pressing or barley milling. The documentation also shows that lower grade wool was not only distributed raw, but also used to make textiles, some of which may have been garments. One of the most notable examples is the Mug textiles, frequently mentioned in administrative documents. These textiles were almost certainly made from Sikimug and intended for practical everyday use. The sources document a wide range of Mug textiles with classifications based on size, thickness, color, and condition. Common variant includes Mug Murub, medium-sized, Tur, small, Kal, Silkangi, black. This vocabulary reflects a precise technical awareness and suggests that different types of Mug were intended for specific uses depending on durability, dimensions, or context. As noted by Pomponio, these textiles often appear in quite large quantities, although not always with an indication of the recipient. These patterns suggest that the allocation of Mug was part of a broader impersonal system, probably meant for general use among low-status workers or dependent personnel. Some documents even record the weight of individual Mug textiles, ranging from about 1.3 to 8 kilograms per unit, depending on subtype and context. Yet, as Pomponio notes, the correlation between weight and category is not consistent. A thick textile is not always heavier than a medium one. This variability likely reflects factors such as dimensions or weaving technique. More important is the broader picture. Siki Moog and Moog textiles appear regularly in administrative records of distribution and provisioning, showing that they were fully integrated into the textile system and exemplify an economic logic of resource maximization. Let us now turn to Ebla, an extraordinarily well-documented administrative center of the 3rd millennium BC. Its importance lies in the quantity and quality of records related to textile distribution. Located in modern-day Syria, Ebla was a major political and economic hub. The royal palace acted as the kingdom's economic core, and the wool management played a key strategic role, remarkable both in scale and organizational complexity. Thousands of texts cover every stage from herd management to the textile distribution. The archaeological data confirm that between 2400 and 2300 BC, about 75% of domestic animals at Ebla were sheep and goats, raised not only for meat but also for wool. Unlike in later periods, wool was usually obtained not by shearing, but by plucking, removing the fleece by hand during the natural molting cycle with tools that functioned as combs. Plucking produced longer, softer fibers with roots and natural lanolin preserved, resulting in higher quality wool, though in smaller quantities. In addition, plucking could be performed several times a year, even if the quality of the fleece declined with each successive round. Written sources refer to wool combs, but it is not always clear whether the same implement was used for both plucking and combing. The Semitic term is mazau. Two tablets are especially informative in this regard. The first one records the allocation of metal for producing combs, knives, and their decorative components. A second text records the delivery of 570 mazau combs to the palace, likely spoils from a campaign led by the ministry Bizikir against the kingdom of Armi. What's particularly interesting is that this same tablet has a duplicate which uses a different term, the Sumerian garig. This suggests that the Sumerian and the Semitic terms are equivalent, as already proposed by Pasquali. A vast number of texts mention a textile called gumug, made from wool byproducts. This term appears at least 1,087 times based on data from the Ebla digital archives, as well as the most recent ARET volumes 14, 19, and 21, which have not yet been added to the database. This abundance of attestations confirm that gumug was not marginal but central to Ebla's economy. The interpretation of gumug has been debated. Lexically, the Sumerian word gu usually means thread or cord. It typically refers to flax, but can also denote wool threads. When combined with mug, it likely referred to fabric made from coarse, low-quality wool threads, what we might call downgraded fibers. Archi has described gumug as an article of clothing certainly very simple, perhaps a kilt originally made of shoddy wool. The sources, however, do not clarify whether it should be understood as a finished garment or rather as a basic textile item, possibly a piece of cloth, a covering, or another practical product. In many cases, gumug appears with the second Semitic term, rigazzi, also attested in variant forms like rigazzu and rigizza. Interestingly, this term is found only in association with gumug, suggesting it designated a specific variant of this textile. According to Pasquali, rigazzi may correspond to the Akkadian rixum, from rakasum, to bind, and could be translated as knot or wrapping. So gumug rigazzi might mean gumug textile with knots. This interpretation is supported by another tablet which records the location of gudul keshda, meaning gudul textile with knots, as opposed to gudul nu keshda, gudul textile without knots. In this case, the Semitic term is replaced by its Sumerian equivalent keshda, knot, confirming that the presence or absence of knots was a meaningful feature. At Ebla, in the 3rd millennium BC, wool textiles were a central element of the palace economy. Their production and the distribution were tightly managed by the central administration and functioned as a key mechanism for resource allocation. Textiles could be adjusted, but in quantity and quality, according to specific needs. They served internally as rations or rewards, and externally as diplomatic gifts or tribute. This flexibility made them an effective instrument of economic and social negotiation. The main source for studying textile redistribution is a corpus of about 500 administrative tablets, known by modern scholars as the monthly account of textiles. These documents, covering roughly 40 years, register both routine allocations to workers and state personnel and exceptional disbursements related to military campaigns, foreign delegations, or religious ceremonies. The wide array of recipients includes weaver, household staff, messengers, musicians, merchants, ambassadors, and in some cases, members of the royal family. Several types of textiles are listed in the records, including the adaum, actum, idtri, and so on, and most relevant to our topic, the gumug. As we will see, these textiles were frequently assigned to workers and court employees. The quality and type of textile received were not merely practical matters. They reflected the recipient's position within the institutional hierarchy. The gumug must therefore be interpreted within this broader redistributive logic, which mapped the relationships between individuals and the central administration across the kingdom. Let us now turn to the gumug corpus. The analysis presented here draws on a substantial part of the more than 1,000 attestations of this term in the Ebla texts. Although the full corpus is still under examination, the material already reviewed is extensive enough to reveal clear patterns in the management and the distribution of textiles made from wool byproducts. A first key observation is that gumug often appears together with other textile types. At least 15 different combinations are attested, with gumug listed alongside one or more textiles in the same record. The most recurring combination includes 3 types: gumug, sal, and ibtri. The sal appears to be a light robe or cloak used by both men and women. The ibtri is a basic garment, likely a sash or a kilt, wrapped 3 times around the waist. Although sometimes issued to deities or royalty, its function remained practical. In these sets, the standard allocation is 1 unit of each textile per recipient, though some records show larger group deliveries. This suggests a level of standardization possibly tied to the structure of work teams or administrative subdivisions. A second common pattern shows gumug distributed on its own. Again, 1 item per person is typical, but we also find bulk distribution. For instance, in one text, we find the delivery of 51 gumug textiles, though the recipients are not preserved due to the tablet's fragmentary condition. What can we infer from this partial but consistent data? First, gumug could circulate either alone or as part of a composite allocation. Second, the varying quantities, single units or large batches, point to a flexible system able to respond to different needs and ranks. In short, despite being made from lower grade wool, Gumug was a fully integrated component of Ebla's redistributive strategy. It met everyday needs while ensuring no usable fiber went to waste. Who received these textiles? What role did they play in Ebla's economy and how were they managed in administrative records? Let us begin with the recipients. Whether distributed alone or in combination with other textiles, Gumug was assigned to a wide range of individuals, both men and women, across multiple social and professional categories. Recipients included unskilled laborers and weavers, but also merchants, messengers, and overseers of mule teams. Others came from the world of performance, dancers, acrobats, and singers, while still others were artisans like carpenters or attendants serving in the royal court. This broad distribution confirms its function as a practical, everyday textile, though attestations show it could also be delivered to individuals of higher rank. Besides internal redistribution, Gumug could also be used in exchange transactions. Some documents record it as a barter good, traded for timber or even livestock. Though not widespread, these cases show that even a textile made from wool waste had economic value outside the palace redistribution system. Interestingly, in some texts, Gumug is labeled as ful, a Sumerian adjective meaning bad or defective. This confirms its perceived material inferiority. Yet, this did not affect its usability. The frequency of its distribution and the care with which it was tracked show that it remained a viable resource fully integrated into the palace system. From an accounting perspective, Gumug often appears in a separate final tallies, even when recorded alongside other textiles. For example, in Art 4.1, the closing lines report total 668 textiles, 57 Gumug textiles, expense of the fourth month. This separate listing suggests that Gumug formed a distinct administrative category, likely due to their lower value or special use. In short, Gumug textiles, though made from substandard wool, were not marginal. They were functional, traceable, and embedded within both the economic and bureaucratic frameworks of the Ebla administration. To conclude, this comparative overview of Ur-3 Mesopotamia and 3rd millennium Ebla showed that wool byproducts were not discarded, but systematically reintegrated into production cycles. Despite the fragmentary nature of the sources, several points emerge clearly. Deliberate management. Lower quality wool was carefully sorted, weighed, and reassigned in both Mesopotamia and Ebla. Functional value. This material produced practical textiles for workers, artisans, and entertainers, and even served in barter. Administrative recognition. At Ebla, Gumug textiles often appear in separate tallies, treated as a distinct accounting category. Economic intent. Their recurrence points to a conscious strategy of material maximization, not ad hoc solutions. And finally, early efficiency. Long before modern ideas of sustainability, these economies were already optimizing resources under central control. This remains a work in progress. Continued analysis of the Ebla corpus will further clarify the economic role of these so-called waste materials. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giada. And I try to share my screen. It's okay. You can see the screen.
Yes.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Licia, for inviting me. I'm not an expert on this topic, so I would like to share with you some comments and some remarks. Convinced that modern dilemmas always mirror ancient problems, recycling, reusing, and repairing practices are frequently traced back to the ancient world. However, this idea is only partly true in my opinion, because the purpose to minimize resource exploitation and maximize waste prevention, an emergency in the modern world, was not necessarily a serious consideration for ancient people. In fact, what clearly appears different and which must guide our reflections on this matter is the intended purpose behind certain behaviors and practices in the ancient world. In particular, what certain behaviors mean in economic and social terms. Because these practices are not generally limited to the private sphere. Otherwise, it is clear that at its core, the conservation of resources through the prevention and recycling of waste and products is guided today by an ethical imperative to preserve the natural world for future generations. This notion extends beyond one's personal conscience and into the collective responsibility. In the EU, the thematic strategy on the prevention and recycling of waste was established in 2005. The final report is from 2010. This directive draws attention to key environmental impacts to account for products and materials from a life cycle perspective, and to decouple economic growth from the environmental impacts associated with waste generation. In our modern society, the pressure exerted by the human species on the natural environment through the extraction of materials and generation of waste is a fact. A circular economy has emerged as a potential solution to minimize resource exploitation and maximize waste prevention, to restore and regenerate the environment by contributing to sustainability and by optimizing the social, technical, and economic values of materials and products. However, the circular economy is not a uniform concept. It has a pluralist definition, which produces different models for resource use practices or a unique step-by-step process. This remark is important in my opinion because studying recycling phenomena in the ancient Near East must necessarily include a reflection on society and the relationship between society, economy, and environment. Was this relationship perceived in the past? And if so, how was this relationship perceived in the past? What was the awareness of resource use and their life cycle? What was the impact of waste production on society's organization? Needless to say, the ancient civilizations were themselves confronted with environmental problems on various scales, some of which were self-made and some of which were naturally caused. According to the ecologist Wolfgang Haber, the urban systems of ancient Mesopotamia present the first instance in history when humankind centralized vast natural resources, transforming them in culture. This transformation was not unproblematic, However, especially when perceived in the longue durée, it brought with it numerous ecological traps, which were integral to the rise of the great ancient culture, but had unintended long-term effects that we still experience today. An example, the problem of soil salinization in Iraq, for example. However, how does the anthropos or the Anthropocene differs from that of the pre-modern times? The ecologization of history, in Greek Garrard words, does not have to be understood solely in material terms, looking at environmental questions. Rather, we have to realize that the ecological world has always been linked to culture, including language and religion. Therefore, it is important to understand the historical process which has led ancient peoples in their path to Anthropocene and how this has been shaped. About the ancient Near East, different forms of circular economy were probably adopted, perhaps unconsciously, and were useful to control or reduce resources use and waste production. The destruction or transformation of accumulated waste with consequent energy production can be associated with a closing loop economic system. It does not require drastic changes in production and consumption because it destroys products and materials that are simply replaced, although with environmental consequences. Excrement, both human and animal, was used as fuel or fertilizer. Many years ago, Tony Wilkinson had argued that pottery shards in agricultural lands could be attributed to the use of collected household waste as fertilizer, because the concentration of pottery shards would decrease far from settlements. In terms of relationship between ecological and cultural world, Augusta McMahon accurately observed that urban middens, especially garbage, located at certain distance from the city, and would attract scavengers and other kinds of animals, and were associated with evil spirits, demons, or even bad omens. Therefore, the scavenger-driven decomposition played an essential role in removing evil spirits and, in a modern perspective, in ecosystem dynamics, enhancing biodiversity, aiding the destruction and transformation of waste, and contributing to disease control. In a low sustainability economic system, where economy, society, and environment are considered of it is a low sustainability economic system where economy, society, and environment are considered of equal importance. The implementation of one aspect could have caused the degradation of the environment, although archaeology has not clarified until now whether and to what extent it has degraded. A low sustainability economic system also involves recycling practices. This system maximizes resource recovery, but requires changes to production and waste collection, leaving consumption patterns the same. This practice remains one of the least studied and poorly understood aspects of ancient craftsmanship and technology. Metalworking falls into this low sustainability model. However, the impact of recasting and mixing metals is actively debated. A major reason for recycling practices is the ability to produce new fully functional objects from deteriorated or not functional scrap metal, and most ancient metal objects are discarded for recycling if they are not otherwise removed from circulation, for example, by deposition in a burial. During the 3rd millennium BCE Mesopotamia, it was observed that bronze was also recycled. Especially the bronzes from Tel Beidar dating to the early dynastic III period show evidence of this, indicated by a low concentration of tin in the arsenical bronzes. At Ur, the major part of the tin bronzes contains an intermediate concentration of tin, perhaps indicated that the southern Mesopotamia had easier access to tin sources compared to northern sites. However, recycling covers a range of interlinked behaviors, because remelting and recasting a whole object in a new shape is complicated by the range of sources used and estimated loss of 5% of the metal. This loss of material determines the frequency of recycling, because recycled metal objects do not survive beyond a handful of generations. Furthermore, the modification and manipulation of the metal stock are socially significant and central to understanding its movement, conception, and use. Recycling responded to many different needs: production crises, procurement challenges, crisis of the supply chain, but also deliberate destruction of deteriorated or no longer usable artworks and objects, and perhaps phenomena of damnatio memoriae, well known for objects made of other materials. This slide shows a group of metal pieces belonging to the life-size statue of a deity, which was damaged probably for recasting. These pieces, discovered in a debris level, perhaps escaped melting. This example is very far from Mesopotamia, but is used to illustrate this specific form of recycling. Whether ecology and culture are somehow interrelated, I wonder. Did metallurgical production have an environmental impact or not? And was environmental impact a concern for Mesopotamian people in adopting recycling practices? Unfortunately, research on this topic has resulted in conflicting conclusions. Based on measurements of heavy metal enrichment in soils, copper and lead, archaeological sediments, plants, and skeletal remains, interpretations have varied between catastrophic effects to a restricted impact relevant only to those involved in this activity. Some studies concerning the copper ores in Fainan region, southern Jordan, have hypothesized the effects of ancient metal production on levels of pollution in humans living in this area even today. Otherwise, in the Timna Valley, southern Arab of soil due to smelting was considered spatially discrete, concentrated only in areas directly associated with these activities. This enrichment aligns with the spatial distribution of metallurgical waste. The conclusion is the economy reflects the structured arrangement of patterns, roles, institutions, and norms within the society, whereas the dependence of economy and society on the environment is uncertain. Economic reasons are behind reuse and recycling practices and strictly linked to the organization of the society. The economic system 1 and 2 we have described before have low sustainability because they do not promote a collective responsibility in waste prevention, reusing, repairing, and remanufacturing, changes in production, consumption, and waste management. The recycling and reuse of building materials were rarely embedded into models of economy, although this practice was extensive in the past. Even more rarely have attempts been made to assess the scale of these practices. They have remained marginalized in archaeological studies, perhaps confused or overlapping with the idea of waste, which is itself at the heart of the archaeological method. The terminology itself is a debated issue. Different activities need different names, procedures, and goals. A first distinction concerns discarded materials, which become refuse to be moved or destroyed when they are no longer wanted by the persons who possess them for a number of different reasons. A functional substitution, stylistic obsolescence, or even negative associations. This is distinguished from reuse, which generally includes the practice of employing material recovered from provisional discard, de facto discard, either for their original purpose or for some other application. When an undiscarded waste is allowed to remain in the place where it was generated, it is sometimes taken up and utilized as raw material in a productive process of part of recycling practice. Recycling, in fact, is conceived as a process involving the transformation of the nature of the material through reprocessing, for example, the melting of glass and metal. However, not everyone agrees on these distinctions. In fact, documented practices are more numerous, including the reuse of old materials in situ, along with new material and techniques. In ancient Mesopotamia, and probably throughout the Near East, it is possible to identify sectors in which recycling affected production and consumption, such as metalworking, and others where it was more marginal. Building and rebuilding activities were, for example, a peculiar aspect of kingship and royal ideology. The vast majority of royal inscriptions are building inscriptions, written on foundation documents, on the bricks, on door sockets, etc. As early as the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia had a high level of urbanism, involving the distribution of foodstuff, the production of consumer goods, and the shaping of the built environment, all of which produced refuse requiring attention, attempts, and ways to discard it. In Mesopotamian architecture, the most characteristic building product is mud brick, sun-dried or baked, which is widely attested from the Alaf period onwards. In this case, the environment played a fundamental role in making brick so common in ancient Mesopotamia, but the abundance of raw materials, clay and straw, and the difficulties in accessing other building materials. It is generally accepted that bricks changed their shape and size throughout Mesopotamian history. These features are important chronological indicators in terms of absolute chronology. Each period is characterized by a specific brick type. A special role is played by the scribed bricks, characterized by short cuneiform texts with the king's name and titles. These materials take on a particular meaning because they are directly associated with the royal building practices. The reuse practices of these materials become a manifesto of the extent and size of construction programs of Mesopotamian kings. In construction practices, it can be observed that 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC, baked and scribed bricks were usually reused within many buildings, among which temples. This practice is known in Ur, Larsa, Nippur, Isin. This behavior raises questions. Which materials were and were not reused? In what quantities? In what times and places? The origin of these reused materials is sometimes unknown. Did they come from the same building? Or had they been discarded and moved to specific places to be reused? Who participated in reusing operations, and how was the work organized? What were the motivations for reusing? To what extent did reusing affect the place, work organization, costs, and/or practices and techniques of production? In the case of baked bricks, it can be assumed that they were better preserved and therefore more reusable compared to sun-dried bricks. However, it can be observed that the reuse of baked bricks also lowered the baking costs, reducing the use of kilns and fuel, and made better use of existing resources from an environmental perspective. What role did the state administration play in reusing bricks? How intensive and extensive were reuse practices, and what impact did this have on the volume and composition of refuse deposits? How did reusing practices differ between time periods? To what extent and in what ways did concept of wealth, health, and consumption determine or condition these practices? All these questions await an answer with a detailed study of the material and context. However, I wonder if this issue can be addressed only in terms of environmental impact and cost reduction. In the Kassite period, for example, the reuse of inscribed bricks is well known, especially in the southern cities, Ur, Larsa. These materials date back to the 3rd millennium BCE, early dynastic period, and 3rd dynasty of Ur, or the early 2nd millennium BCE, Isin Larsa period. These practices fall into the large-scale building activities by Kurigalzu I, 14th century BC, conducted as part of his wider program of rebuilding in some of the major cities of southern Babylonia and a clear policy of the establishment a royal presence in the south. We know that the work sponsored by Kurigalzu was extensive, although beyond the building remains, the evidence for Kassite period occupation in this region is limited. The intent to implement a deliberate policy only aimed at restoring and consolidate a royal presence in southern Babylonia could also be reflected on the activities of careful restoration and minimal alteration to protect the structure's integrity. Repurposing older buildings for new use ensures its continued relevance and viability. The preservation of cultural significance through the visibility of floors made of older bricks ensures the memory of narratives, events, and identities, generated knowledge, appreciation, and respect. Materiality also probably played a significant role. Using reclaimed materials or those reflecting the original construction may have created a coherent dialogue between the historical and more recent aspects of the building, reinforcing their cultural significance and enhancing their aesthetic harmony as part of a strategy to bring back the kingship in these places, where Samsu-Iluna and subsequent First Dynasty of Babylon kings largely had ceased to appear. To conclude, efforts to investigate recycling and reusing practices in a past society is made problematic by the fact that they often involve reprocessing materials, which often results in the destruction or transformation of the material into a different form that renders it difficult, if not impossible, to recognize archaeologically. The set of materials that any community chooses to recycle is determined by a complex, community-specific, and often shifting array of circumstances, including the size of the community and the cost and availability of virgin raw materials of non-local origin. The methods that were employed to recover recycled and reused material and to transfer them from the point where it was collected to the point where it was employed in a new productive process remain largely obscure. However, as this workshop tries to do, it may be possible to begin to fill some of these gaps by employing available data to formulate conjectures regarding how various recycling and reusing operations might have been organized and carried out in ancient Mesopotamia. Thank you for your attention.
Leonor, thanks. Good afternoon, and thanks, Alicia, for the organization of this amazing and stimulating workshop. And I hope that I can add a contribution. I don't know if a stimulating contribution to the discussion. So what I'm trying to present is a kind of a experiment in trying to apply the use of stratigraphic terminology using in archaeological field during the excavation to the architecture to understand, in fact, how we can recognize the different not only way and technique of building, but even if we can distinguish among the different features of the architecture to recognize original part of the building that have been reused, remade, they change their plans, and if we can recognize, in fact, in the architecture, in the stratigraphy, these elements. As a matter of fact, as already Silvana Di Paolo was, in fact, actually just presenting the use of mud bricks, and I specifically focus on mud bricks instead of the baked bricks, is a crucial and typical element of Mesopotamian archaeology and in general of the archaeology of ancient Western Asia. The use of mud brick is fascinating, not only because, as we can see during the excavation and from the buildings that have already been excavated in the past, huge construction and huge projects have been done, but as we know, mud bricks are quite difficult issues, not only during the excavation itself, but also for the preservation and the restoration after the excavation finished. So the point is that it seems that even in the past, and the study by Irene Winter, when she focused on the first archaeologists of ancient Mesopotamia during the Neo-Babylonian period, the idea of preserving and recognizing the different elements of an architecture, specifically, for example, for stratified buildings such as temples, has been central even for the ancient people living in ancient Mesopotamia. And this is very clear if we go through even the excavation that have been done in Iraq. And here you have the study that was presented in 2014 by Jean-Claude Margueron, when he analyzed the stratigraphy of the temple and private houses sectors of Hafaja, specifically so in the Diyala, where he was able, in fact, to recognize through the section drawings that were presented by the Oriental Institute expedition in the Diyala region, that in fact many buildings have been reused across time, and even in a very short time, because we are in fact specifically within the early dynastic period. But this reuse is not always the same. So you have buildings and walls of buildings that are reused, but at the same time you might detect changes in plans, changes in the position, and even older walls that have been in fact used as a foundation for the new walls of the new buildings. So it is quite complex, I would say, to recognize such a distinction when you are dealing with Adobe architecture, and when it is difficult to make a distinction between the soil of the mud bricks from the soil that is the strata that you are excavating within the same building and within, for example, the rooms of the same building. So what I'm trying to in fact do and present today is, as I said, an experiment in trying to apply a terminology to a specific case study from the ongoing project of the excavation at Zurghul, the ancient Nigin, southern Iraq. We already had the chance in 2021 to recognize from aerial photos, actually from drones, the identification of a kind of lines and rooms in the lower city, where then just a few soundings have been done, actually only via a scraping of the surface. And we were able to see how, in fact, even from aerial photos and then the detection in the field on the ground, the problem of the mud bricks and understanding, in fact, the use of such materials for buildings, and specifically within a very short period that is, in this case, is the ED1, so early dynastic one. But indeed, my main focus will be in area A, where we had a quite extensive, larger excavation from 2015 until, in fact, 2018. And hopefully enough, we should reopen this area exactly in 15 days, when we will start the new season in Iraq, linking area A to area E, where we have this evidence of what we, for the moment, are calling a multifunctional building. So we are not able yet to define it either as a palace or a temple, even I would say a house, because we have too scanty information. But the real interesting aspect of this area is that, as you can see, we have a quite very well stratified sequence going from the late Uruk until the ED1. And this was, in fact, the sequence that we were able to identify through the study of material culture, mainly pottery. But the main point of the presentation of today is, in fact, to try to focus if we can identify these different elements, and I would say even this chronological difference within the stratigraphy of the architecture. It is not so always easy to do, because sometimes you do not have enough information or enough data to make such an analysis, and even because many of the structure have been, in fact, reused even in the past. And even, I would say, the modern and contemporary state of preservation of Iraqi sites might have affected this possibility to have a quite complete, for example, stratigraphy, because you have a high degree of erosion, sites that have been occupied and reused, and we have not to forget the said long, unfortunately, period of Iraq, a country that suffered from war quite for a long and I would say too long period. Nevertheless, so architecture, starting from the idea of architecture as something that means elements that have to be been built. So the construction part, you have first planning, and so you have to identify the place and how you want to build the building. The phase of construction, that mainly is the central part, so the construction of the building that of course implies that a use and the life of the building, and then you might have a restoration or even a reconstruction. So this is very clear, for example, when you are dealing with the huge public buildings in ancient Mesopotamia, for example, as temples, but as I was referring before, even from the private houses in the Diaro region, you might have this sequence of planning, construction, restoration, and even reconstruction or reuse. As a matter of fact, since the topic of the workshop organized by Licia, I concentrate on restoration and reconstruction, and I'm wondering how these two terms, restoration and reconstruction, might in fact be used then as a repair. So the building is restored and reconstructed just because there is a new plan, a new building that has been designed and built, or is in fact a repair of something that is, for example, missing, or something that has been destroyed, or something that decayed because of time or any other elements that might be also weather and atmospherical elements. So the repair should just be the occasion to make a kind of restoration or maintenance of the original building, or it could be the chance to introduce a change, so to modify the plan of the building or enlarge the building, and so to have a new possibility to identify then another building. So from the construction, I then pass through the architecture dealing with its stratigraphic part. So how can we translate in a certain way our stratigraphy methods of the archaeological excavation into a stratigraphy of architecture? So I would try to make an example based on the building we are excavated in Tel Zurghul, and so I would I identified these key words or key elements, if you want. So we have the architectural complex, and within we have the building elements. Within the building elements, you have the functional units that you can recognize as stratigraphy building units and the architectural elements. So it's a kind of sequence that you have to read from top down. And then I will now try to use these terms applied to the building we excavated in Iraq. So for example, the architectural complex is in fact the building we identified in area A. The building elements are the single parts and the structures that we identified within the main building. You have functional units that are what we can define as the delimited space of the building elements. So for example, rooms or courtyard. You have the stratigraphic building units that are the building action that you can recognize when you have, for example, to analyze how a building has been built. So a wall has a foundation, then you have the proper wall that has been built. If then within this wall there is a doorway, there are, for example, windows, so you have the different building actions within the same elements. And then you have the additional architectural elements that might be arches, pillars, could be benches that you can recognize within the building. So the idea is to try to pass from the architecture as a process of construction, as a process of stratigraphy to identify the different elements, and if then these can be a useful methodology to recognize the different phases, specifically for what concern the restoration or reconstruction, or as I said, the repair action. The stratigraphic building units that is specifically interesting, they might be constructive action, so you have to build up, but they might also be destructive actions. So for example, and we will see, you might have a stratigraphic building units within a room, so you might have walls that are the perimeter of a room, but then they are also provided with doorways because you need to enter and go out from a room. But these doorways might be then closed, for example, in a later period, and new doorways might be open. So you might have at the same time a constructive action, so you build up a room with walls and doorways, but at the same time you might have, let's say, a destructive action. So you close an older doorways and you open new ones. That means that you have to cut a walls to build a new doorways. So going inside the example that I choose, this is some pictures of the so-called multifunctional building we so far identified, and we are still excavating in area A at Zurghul. We were in fact able to understand that this building exactly as it was clear from the study of the material culture, so has different phases from the late Uruk until the Idiwad. So the point is that, okay, we have different phases that are confirmed by the study of the material culture, but how then can we relocate this material culture or the use of the building within this long period time from late Uruk until Idiwan? And in fact, the excavation that was going on specifically, it was specifically done mainly in 2016, identified at least 3 phases in the 3rd millennium BC. So we have the Jemdet Nasr phase, the transitional phase between Jemdet Nasr and ED1, and then a proper ED1 phase. And we were in fact able to see that buildings and the walls have been changed. So they have been built, but at the same time, they have been changed. So the plans was changed because walls were rebuilt, doorways were closed, and other doorways were opened at the same time. And the idea, in fact, is to try to combine how we can identify in the stratigraphy, I mean in the architectural stratigraphy, these elements that were identified with the terms that I presented to you before. So you have here, for example, in blue, something that can be a destructive unit, a destructive action, because you used ancient material just for the foundation of a new walls. You have the original part specifically of the Jemdet Nas period that are pointed out in green, but at the same time, this wall, specifically the one that you see in the background to the south of the area, this wall has been then reused and remade during the ED1, that is the part marked in red. And these, quite interestingly enough, they are plano-convex bricks. So you can also detect not only that you have a stratigraphy within the walls, but that this stratigraphy is even also marked out by the different use of specific bricks that in a certain way we can even say they might also have a they could be, let's say, a chronological marker. We are not so sure. I think that we should reconsider the idea that the plano-convex bricks are specifically of the ED1, but in a certain way, we can still reconsider or understand the use of this type of material as a kind of a chronological marker, specifically in the very beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. So the general plan of the building that you can see here at the end of the excavation in 2016 made us now to understand that we have a complex building. Not only is a multifunctional building, but is also a complex building made of different phases with walls that have been built. So we have the main, let's say, stratigraphic unit of the construction, but at the same time, we were able to recognize the changing in plans. So with doorways that have been at a certain point closed, so specifically in the passage from Jemdet Nazar to ED1, and at the same time, walls that have been raised up during the ED1, so using the old and the older walls as the foundation for the new buildings. So trying to combine the terminology that I was presenting before and the evidence of the area A into Zurghul, we can say that the entire area, so area A, is the architectural complex that is at the moment excavated only partially. And as I said, we should expand exactly this year to the north and to the east. Within you have the building elements, so the different elements that made of the architectural complex. And within you have the functional units, for example, the rooms and the courtyard that we were able to identify, and the stratigraphic building units, for example, the opening of the doorways within the building. Such as stratigraphic building units, as I said, they might have a positive or a negative value. So they could be a constructive actions, so building up, but they might also be a destructive action. So you cut part of the building to reopen a doorway, or you are using scattered materials. And even here, maybe we can, this is not the occasion and the time to reflect on, but even the reuse of pottery as part of the architecture and the rebuilding could be quite interesting in the topic that we are facing in these days in the workshop. And the constructive action can also be the rebuilding of a wall using a different kind of bricks that belongs to a different phase, and so to the probably rebuilding, re-enlarging, and the changing plan of the building. So the stratigraphic architecture needs to be analyzed vertically and, of course, horizontally. So you might have vertical overlapping that you can, in fact, recognize when you are specifically focusing on the walls, but even horizontal overlapping. So the different strata, for example, the different plastering of floor can also be something to be investigated in the idea of making a stratigraphy of the architecture. So what does it mean arriving to the conclusion? So I would say that architectural stratigraphy, together with the more common archaeological stratigraphy, is the combination that give us what I define here is the analysis and the comprehension of the building. So starting from the technique of a construction, but even of the building. So I mean of the product of this construction, so that is its use, life, duration, changing, repairing, reconstruction, or even as we can find sometime in the archaeological evidence, the destruction and abandonment of a building or of an area. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we can go on with the discussion of these issues in the coming lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for organizing this meeting. I appreciate the kind invitation. Do you see my screen?
We can
You see
see your screen. If you want to put it in present mode, it might make it bigger for us.
That's what I did. How
Okay.
about now?
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks again. It's good to see you, especially those of you that I'm used to see them in the field only. Good to see you again. I guess we're gonna switch a little bit from inside ancient cities, Mesopotamian cities, and bricks and other building materials to more of off-site and landscape in relation observation, exploration in relation to land reuse and enhancement. I'll give a quick background about the location for those of you who are not familiar with the site and the area I'm going to talk about. The site of Lagash, which is also known as Tel al-Hiba or Tilul al-Hiba, locally is located 280 kilometers southeast of the capital city of Baghdad. With an area which exceeds 400 hectares, the site is considered one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in southern Mesopotamia. In antiquities and from the region of this ancient city, we have references to extensive marshes. Further, topographical and archaeological maps, along with recently obtained ethnographic information, confirm the existence of these marshes. More accurately, geoarchaeological studies and analysis, part of the Lagash archaeological project, which is ongoing, have been able to bring forward scientific evidence on the existence of water sources and possible environmental shifts throughout history throughout the history of the region of Lagash. Indeed, throughout history, the inhabitants of the marshy area of Lagash have found an abundance of fresh water, fish, waterfowl, water plants, salt, and other natural items. These would have made a reliable nutrition base along with little to no cultivation in the area. In recent decades, seasonal fluctuation in the water level of the Lagash marshes leading to drought conditions have contributed to the creation of environmental changes to the local farmers who invest in the limited lands suitable for crops, either in the marshes or in their fringes. To investigate the adaptation of Lagash local community to drought conditions and limited agriculture, first, we explored one land feature that seems to have been created or maintained for cultivation. And second, we observed a simple agricultural practice that seems to help with the common problem, ancient problem of soil salinity in the area. With the arid conditions around the site, certain features became visible. Through satellite imagery, and exploration was directed toward a low-rise area to the east of the main mound of Lagash. This spot measures about 30 hectares, and it appears to have similar characteristics and morphological appearance to that site to the west of Lagash known as Tel al-Abyad, which has already been registered as archaeological. We expected that the eastern mound was archaeological in the fall of 2021, accompanied by Dr. Paul Zimmerman and Dr. Reed Goodman and other State Board of Antiquities and Heritage representative, namely Bakr Adab. I conducted the first walking survey on the eastern mound. Unlike Tel al-Abyad, cultural materials were not evident on the surface of the eastern mound. We walked over the entire site, finding nothing that indicated archaeological presence. Later in the spring of 2022, for further verification, we established a test pit on the highest point of the eastern mound, of the eastern mound. In case cultural materials were covered by the marsh water depositions due to frequent progression and recession in water level. We worked in a 2x2 test pit with 1.2 meter depth. Only one pottery sherd was found in the northern section of the pit, which suggests that this was brought to this area through recent human activities. Close to the northeastern corner of the pit, fragments of animal skull, possibly buffalo or cow or camel, were found. These observations, in addition to the soil colors, which indicates different characteristics. Types, which I'm not going to go through right now, indicates that this low-mounded area is not archaeological. Further investigation of this area included ethnographical information. Local community members indicated that this mound was naturally formed and that community members used to work on leveling its surface in preparation for cultivation season. In addition, the last season of cultivation exploration were reported to have been during the 1990s. Additional ground investigation of the surrounding of this mound reveals an old opening of a major and very shallow canal, which would have been supplied from the adjacent marsh. Since the extension of this canal is invisible from the ground, we planned drone mission to collect an automatic view to the surface of the mound. The result was a well-planned canal system which would have been used for irrigation. This system consists of a major shallow canal that runs across the mound, generally from the north to the south, in a curved way. From this canal, many smaller canals branched off toward the southeastern side of the mound, which would have been for carrying water to the cultivated area. Whether the claim of the locals is accurate, this feature shows that the mound could have been entirely man-made by accumulating dirt from the surrounding areas to create a slightly raised ground suitable for cultivation. Evidence of such practice is indicated in anthropological studies of the 1950s and 1960s in the marshy areas farther south in southern Iraq. In the area of Lagash, this practice indicates a way of adaptation by the local communities in establishing cultivable land as secondary source of economy during difficult and low water level of the marshes. The second practice observed took place at one of the small local agricultural fields located to the southeast of the site Lagash. In this case, farmers observed practicing what they called soil washing. Unlike the case of the eastern mound cultivation, this process takes place at the edges of the marshes where small fields or gardens occur. Farmers would have access to fresh water through nearby main canal in modern times, of course, with the machines. From this canal, they bring the water to their uncultivated field sections. They let the water run and soak these fields. Then they discharge the foamy water at the other end of the fields where the marsh begins. The density of foam in the discharge water reflects the amount of salt extracted from the inarable farms sections. Repeating this process during farming seasons allow for cleansing salty lands, making them ready for cultivation in the next season. An interesting factor in this process is that farmers go through this process while they irrigate their good parts of the farmland. So they save time and effort significantly. While basically they cleanse the lands that are not usable in the meantime, in the same time they irrigate their good parts of the farmland so they cultivate at the end of the season. When asked, the farmers cannot report on when they or their ancestors started to use this simple strategy. Rather, they always say, we have always been doing this cleansing or soil washing basically forever. The simplicity of the soil washing strategy suggests its deep roots in Mesopotamian history, especially when its simple elements are considered. Fresh water from a canal, farmland, and a lower ground for discharge at the end. These are components that have always been in existence in southern Mesopotamia and now in modern Iraq. The two cases of creating farmland along with simple irrigation system and enhancing existing land by cleansing the harmful salt need further investigation to obtain technical and scientific details. Reporting on these two interesting cases represents the first attempt to understand how inhabitants in marshy areas like the one around Lagash adapt to environmental changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid, for the presentation on the interdisciplinary approaches to.
Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
And can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay, so here we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting workshop. The time is running out, so let's go straight into the Sumerian countryside, and of course, according to cuneiform sources. Humanity was born in the time of myth, when the lesser gods rebelled against their lords because the labor placed upon them was too heavy to endure. Thus, humankind was created, an humble workforce meant to shoulder the burdens of hydraulic maintenance. A beautiful story, but difficult to understand because none of us here can truly quantify the effort required by such an activity. On the other hand, I like to investigate seek terms of comparison, not so much to understand the myth itself, but rather to grasp the actual living condition of the people who inhabited Lower Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. And indeed, there is an episode in Iraqi history that almost faithfully mirrors the Sumerian tale. In the 9th century, the revolt by African slaves, the Zang, shook the region of Basra and the marshland. According to Popovich, the causes that led to rebellion were the exhausting working condition required for digging the irrigation channels and, above all, for reclaiming the land. Indeed, the saline crust that effectively seals the soil, undermining the growth of cereals, had to be removed before every sowing. From a spatial perspective, approximately 7,000 ridges have been calculated along the calculated along the edge of the Shuttle Arab. Embankments up to 1 kilometer long, about 50 meters wide, and around 2 meters high. According to Brown and Joteri, the entire system equates to an investment of human labor on a grand scale, requiring either a huge workforce. The most likely hypotheses are that the earthwork are products of either the clearance and preparation of the land to bring new areas into cultivation, and the long-term maintenance of agriculturally productive areas, requiring the frequent cleaning of canals and clearance of sediments deposited through irrigation. In summary, the revolt turned into 14 years of war, fought in the marshland territory. Exactly as in the war between the Assyrian and the Chaldeans, the rebels exploited the marshes and reeds beds to hide, launch sorties, and attack enemy boats in the river battles, while stones were hurled at the enemy from the top of the embankments. Even in the modern times, the marshland territory has not lost its strategic value, and indeed the assault between Iraqi and Iranian troops were carried out in the same way: penetrate the enemy territory with ships and defend oneself by reinforcing the structures of embankments. Ideally, the territory itself dictates the strategy of battle, one that has remained unchanged since the time of Urnanche, who, in addition to recording the first war account in history, listed among his most illustrious prisoners the captain of the enemy ships from Ur. I wanted to introduce my talk with these remarks to show how the territory in question is profoundly impactful for those who inhabit it. First and foremost, hydraulic maintenance and the management of the countryside are fundamental to the stability of the system, whose effects consolidate the territory. The concept of maintenance therefore takes on a dual meaning, both civil, ensuring the safety of agricultural areas, and military, since the embankments not only hold back the water but also block the enemy advances, whether in the time of Urnanche, of Ali ibn Muhammad, or during the Iranian invasion. What is certain is that in the third millennium before Christ, the technologies, materials, and tools available for shaping the landscape were different from those of the medieval period, as was the number of workers who could be employed. The territory considered in this contribution can be located in the so-called Lower Mesopotamia at the time of the third dynasty of Ur, that is, at the end of the third millennium BC. Speaking of landscape, however, the designation Lower Mesopotamia can be ambiguous. Although the toponym might suggest environmental uniformity, this is not the case. Rather, it was a complex context due to the nature of the rivers that dominated the region, as well as the sea, which 5,000 years ago reached the area of Nasiriyah. From upstream to downstream, the cities of Kish, Nippur, and Isin arose along the banks of the Euphrates on its main course or its major branches. Similarly, from upstream to downstream, Adab, Karkar, Umma, and Zabalam developed along the Tigris. This concerned the middle section of the two rivers. Downstream from the Isin and Adab rivers lies in the delta area, the subject of this study, which I have partially reconstructed from a geographical point of view. This is based on the study of 27 administrative texts from Girsu, so dossier on the hydraulic maintenance of the region, with the measurements of the territory itself and the location of many of its extra-urban elements like fields, channels, villages, cities. In the region of Lagash, which extend across the delta area of the Tigris, from here comes the highest number of texts dedicated to the care of the extra-urban countryside. In fact, more than 100 Economies are attested in the territory of approximately 3,000–5,000 square kilometers, on which about 30 watercourses can be geographically reconstructed based on ancient indication. The reconstruction I have carried out of the Lagash region represents in effect its cadastral layout at the end of the 3rd millennium BC. That is, the network of waterways along with the structure established by the communities on the riverbanks, so fields, storehouses, temples, villages, cities. The result is a space cut through by at least 3 main branches of the Tigris: the Ningi Shadu Channel, Bizagle Channel, and last but not least, the Piringindu Channel. These were large watercourses extending for well over 20 kilometers, with earthen embankments up to 4 meters height and riverbeds more than 80 meters wide. These main channels were interconnected by medium-sized branches such as the Piringindu Channel or the Inun Channel, ranging between 10 and 20 kilometers in length, with embankments about 2 meters height, of course, according with cuneiform sources. Finally, there were minor channels cutting across the large island formed between the waterways, such as the Iluduga Channel, which connects the Tigris to the Bizagle for 5 kilometers. Based on the study of the confluences, it is evident that the Lagash region was a maze of watercourses and thus an area at extremely high hydraulic risk. Details such as the sinuosity of the beds, their unplanned interconnections, the type of embankment damage, and the practice for their maintenance suggest the presence of a natural environment stabilized by humans through functional yet perishable hydraulic works. This was therefore not the same already anthropized landscape in which the Zhang revolt broke out. But rather its original form at the beginning of the colonization of the countryside. From this arise the problem. Sumerian hydraulic defense was fragile, and it was determined by the time and managed by a limited number of local workers. Neglect maintenance or exceptional and unexpected rainfall could alter the balance of the system and bring it rapidly to collapse. Moreover, the muddy beds of the main river and their branches promoted the elevation of the watercourses above the level of the fields, subjecting the territory to constant transformation caused precisely by the migration of the channels during the flooding. In this respect, it should be noted that the expected flood levels of the Tigris and the Euphrates today correspond to those calculated in Sumerian time, approximately 4 or 5 meter rise in water level. The stability of the system, and therefore of the state, was guaranteed only through routine maintenance of the hydraulic structure, particularly the levees, the embankment. However, kilometer-long embankments required vast amounts of material for repairs. Using as a model my reconstruction of the Sumerian landscape in the Lagash region, it is possible to reflect on the use of material management also in relation to the logistics of their use, thereby assisting more precisely the problems that undermine the system and the solution implemented to mitigate the hydraulic risk. From the administrative texts dedicated to hydraulic maintenance, it is possible to understand how riverbanks were divided into segments of responsibility, each entrusted to an inspector, so the canal watcher, and a landholder, the owner of the fields across which the levees passed. Embankment failures could occur for two reasons. The force of the water eroding into the embankment, or animal burrows, especially foxes, that damage the structure from within, according with cuneiform sources. In the event of flood, the time frame for a levee breach was about 1 hour, whether caused by overtopping, piping, or liquefaction. Once the problem was identified, the inspector reported it, thereby initiating the procedure for restoration. First, an estimate of the damage was made to calculate the amount of soil required for the repair, followed by the economic cost to be sustained. The inspection recorded in the stage of work by calculating the difference between the estimate and the final state at the conclusion of the repairs. From that point on, field work was completed, and the data collected would be assessed by the administration for the final reports. Here you can see an example of the dossier about maintenance. The intervention could be described as colossal. For example, the regulation of the Bizzagale watercourse was carried out over a distance of 37 kilometers, requiring approximately 115,650 cubic meters of soil, managed by 47 supervisors. The reconstruction of the most critical breach in the embankment wall involved in 3.75 meters of deep into the earthen body, with an height of 4 meters. From a technical standpoint, this damage spreads across 37 kilometers, implies an average breach volume of about 3 cubic meters for every meter. But the soil could not be taken from the riverbed itself, since excavation that would weaken the foot of the embankment. Furthermore, the cost of the manpower had to be taken into account. From the text, we know that one man could dig about 3 cubic meters of earth per day. Therefore, 28,355 workers would be required, possibly employed across multiple days, equivalent to 1,278 men working for 1 month. Yet this reconstruction cannot be isolated from the wider environmental reality under discussion, because the water courses in the Lagash region are over 100. In more detail, the administrative compendium ISJ 13-222-69 indicates that over the course of 4 months, 16,005 men and animals were employed for hydraulic maintenance across the entire region, covering 25 different localities and waterways. Ideally, this corresponds to an average of about 160 piecework laborers, so 3 men per site, spread over 25 work sites for 4 months. This was a modest free and local labor force, which had to be coordinated wisely in order to maintain order in the countryside, an area estimated about 3 or 5,000 square kilometers according to the Pettinato calculations. This figure, however, does not reflect the actual size of the labor force. It is useful primarily for understanding the system of payment. A piecework labor employed for 30 days is recorded as 30 men paid, since it receives 30 daily wages. Sinclair reflections on the case study of Umma is exemplary. The hundreds of Umma tablets recording thousands of man days create an impression of a labor force of tens of thousands. However, once the work assignments are reconstructed, it turns out that the labor force behind them was very modest, probably no more than 1,000 manual workers. In comparison, according to Al-Tabari, the Zanger slaves, the number about 15,000 slaves distributed in groups of 500, 5,000 across different estates. Thus, a stable labor force employed fully for digging and reclamation activities. To understand the movement of soil for embankments maintenance, it is necessary to know both the components of the ground and the Sumerian terminology used to identify them. In a simplified form, the soil shows the following vertical stratification: a grass layer, a topsoil in which plant roots are found, the earthy layer or subsoil, and the clay layer, and finally the rocky stratum or bedrock. Based on description of agricultural or excavation parameters in the rural landscape, it is possible to associate Sumerian terminology with almost all of these layers. For example, grass, so the superficial grassy layer covering agricultural fields before sowing. Husaga, the cloth of grass, the superficial soil layer with plants' roots. Sahar, earth, and Im, clay. Now, a brief mention of the last two materials. Based on ample consideration, for a Sumerian observer, the essential difference between earth and mud is qualitative. The words hard, therefore, indicates a mixed or generic composition, so that which is dark. The word im denotes essentially the same element, earth, but specifically implies that it has been worked. The life cycle of clay ends with the inevitable deterioration. For the dismantling of a wall in the house of Niglagar, the residue of an im clay wall for 120 cubic meters of demolished material is called Kik Sahar, so work of earth. Thus, the same material is Sahar in its raw state and Im when it's processed. The quality changes, the production costs change, and the procurement times change. Clay is not suitable for repairing embankments. It would be a huge expensive with very long waiting times. Earth, on the other hand, guarantees speed, but also requires very careful logistics. Let us examine some aspects in more detail. With regard to grasses, we know from various texts, both administrative and literary, that levees were covered in green. The administration was responsible for the routine cutting of the grass mantle, and in case of negligence, lamentation denounced the presence of tall grass as a symptom of decline and defeat. From the composition of farmer instruction, we learn of the need to remove the grass clothes, usaga, before the flooding of the field for sowing. Hence, the normal practice of cleaning the field by putting weeds along with their roots. The same material, grass, clothes, usaga, was also applied to embankments to reinforce the major section. This could involve short stretches, but also work extending over kilometers, as in the case of Nadue Gidu Channel embankment, where an intervention covered 6,900 meters in length and employed 1,530 cubic meters of grass clothes, alongside 20,000 cubic meters of earth. As you can guess, the intervention are very large. As for the earth, this could not be taken from the excavation of artificial ditches. That material was reserved for building their small levees. Moreover, those furrows were refilled at the end of the season. But the excavation of the reservoirs, Kapku, for collecting water provide a much greater volume of earth. In this case, two structural forms can be recognized. well-like basin, narrow and deep up to 3 meters in deep, and marshy-like basin, sometimes extending over a kilometer in length, about 12 meters wide and roughly 1 meter deep. Taking the map fields as reference, you can see in the picture, we can consider two aspects. Its size, 219.24 hectares, entirely surrounded by reservoirs, and the amount of the earth obtained from daily excavation, 77,422 cubic meters. In addition, from the field surface itself, one could obtain a total of 547,600 cubic meters of grass cloths, useful for covering the levee embankments with vegetation. For example, the Piringindu Channel, about 30 kilometers long, was subject to provision of 21,000 cubic meters of grass mixed with earth. However, only 3,800 cubic meters of the total provision was actually used. This fact is significant because knowing that it was a work of construction, so in Sumerian do tree, we can conclude that the material had not been excavated on site, but transported, based on the unanticipated need for repairs. If the material had been locally sourced, there would have been no difference between the accumulated and the allocated amounts. This aspect recurs in many dossiers dedicated to hydraulic maintenance. Therefore, based on large amounts of earth declared in Sumerian texts for hydraulic maintenance, it can be inferred that most of the work material derived from agricultural byproducts, understood as soil obtained from the removal of the superficial layer of fields, transported earth from the excavation of the irrigation reservoir for collecting the river excess water. To a lesser extent, repair material for levees could also come from the cleaning of the riverbank sediment, of course, and possibly from construction debris left from the demolition or restoration of older buildings. The key word in every case is cleaning. Given that we are in a context of poor of raw materials, waste, whatever its form, became a resource. As I well know from farmer instruction, this surface layer had to be removed before flooding the fields. In the same exhausting operation to which the Zang slaves were subjected. The material called Usaga in Sumerian is the same as that attributed to levee reinforcement. From a volumetric standpoint, agricultural byproducts match both what was required for levee maintenance and what was allocated by landowner for their respective strengths of responsibility. For example, the agricultural waste from the Ma field, estimated at 547,000 cubic meters, would have more than sufficient to repair the Naduegitu channel embankments, which require only 1,500 cubic meters for about 7 kilometers of levee. The excavation of its reservoir in the Ma field, almost 77,000 cubic meters of earth, would have almost completely covered the expenditure for restoring the Bizagal channel levee. And the same for the Piringendu banks. Moreover, the estimated agricultural waste from the Ma field aligns with the amounts allocated by individual landholders along the Piringendu channel. This range from a minimum of 117 cubic meters to a maximum of 391,500 cubic meters, for a total of more than 1 million of cubic meters of earth, derived from the fields of the town of Nakabtuma in the Gwydinia region, of which the Piringindu was the major channel and one of its boundary channels. I will conclude with a small hint about the thickness of the system, because if it can be repaired, then it can be also break down altogether. As a fragile system, any alteration of the balance is potentially destructive. One more rainfall can afflict part of it, as happened near the city of Tumal on one tragic night. So the levee of the Euphrates has overflowed in the direction of Tumal. It also overflowed towards the Gershindula field. The water has risen by 75 centimeters. The sun does not come out. 7,200 soldiers did not prevail against the flood, and at least 23,300 hectares of land were lost. My workforce is insufficient. I can get the water up. It's urgent. This was a lecture. Well, the war, however, has a widespread effect through the region, with the description echoes in the lamentation. With the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, the region of Lagash becomes economically depressed as its channels, no longer under control, overflow, bringing the territory back to its original state. The economic damage can be understood from sources, so that it's possible to estimate 300 years of landscape crisis on one of the richest region of Sumer. And we are well reminded of this by Rim-Sin of Lars in his attempt to reclaim the Lagash area. The Iegal and Isiki channels more likely associated with the associated with the three channels of the Iegal camp or Itersikil are mentioned. You can see here in the map, maybe you can see, yes. But it is the description of the Gunundi channel that is particularly striking, revealing the state of neglect in the region, the attempt at its reclamation, but also the dramatic effects of the lack of maintenance. So Rim-Sin, the shepherd who listened the broad country under the order of An, Enlil, and Enki, dug the canal that roars strong. A canal which has not been dug since years, whose banks were covered with reeds, leaving no more arable land. He dug it permanently towards the shore of the sea and made available large areas of arable land. So I hope I have succeeded in delineating the life circle of a Sumerian waterway and above all the complex dynamics of its maintenance. In the context of labor shortage and the scarcity of high-performance tools, the Sumerians were able to invent a circular economy in which waste does not exist, but matter, despite its transformation, remains a resource and as such is precious. So I thank you, and I greet you with an ad hoc Sumerian proverb that reminds us precisely of the fragility of the system. The fate is like a wet bank, and it makes man sleep. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will now leave the stage to Augusta.
Okay, thank you, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. No, I need to share screen, share. Hopefully we're all good. Okay. Anyway, so thank you to Licia for the invitation to speak at this workshop. Thank you to all the workshop participants, and thank you to our global audience as well. My paper examines reuse at the southern Mesopotamian city of Nippur during the first millennium BCE. And the instances of reuse that I'll be looking at are at two different scales, this small and portable versus massive and monumental, and they will also speak to some of the earlier presentations in the workshop as well that we had today. Okay, good. Cities are optimal places for the circular economy, or a closed system of manufacture, use, breakage, and then repair, recycling, reprocessing, or repurposing, and then back to manufacture and use. City dwellers in particular are very well placed to engage consciously with recycling and reuse due to a number of factors, including the large quantities of discarded materials and broken objects that are generated every day in urban contexts, and which are highly visible within the urban landscape. Recycling and reuse are also enabled by cities' large populations. When more people are concentrated in one place, there's high demand for raw materials and for manufactured goods, and there can be episodic scarcities. High demands on their own may encourage recycling and reuse in order to generate the supply needed quite quickly, while scarcities promote reuse and recycling to infill supply gaps. And the energetic crowding, which is often said to be typical of cities, can feed a sense of urgency and a perceived need for immediate solutions instead of waiting to have gaps resolved. Cities also provide the necessary managed spaces for collection, separation, and processing of recycled materials and objects. And we should never forget that often manufacture and recycling takes up a huge amount of space that could potentially be used for other practices and activities. And finally, very large numbers of people interacting with each other offer fertile ground for the development of ideas and innovations in manufacturing, including reuse and recycling. Now, recycling today is driven by concerns about environmental impact and waste reduction, which are probably not as significant in the past. I don't think we can ascribe sustainable design or plans to reduce resource depletion to all past inhabitants of Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia, of course, has many examples of recycled raw materials and reused objects. So some objects are reshaped and reused, while other objects were recycled to return them into raw materials. And I feel it's important to distinguish reuse from recycling because they have different steps, they have different framing, and they have very different outcomes. So as I use these terms, reuse acts on the potential of the object in reshaping it, while recycling exploits the potential of an object's component materials. So in Mesopotamia, beads and seals we know are inherited and reused long after their styles are often archaic or out of date. Statues could be recarved into smaller statues or chipped into tools. Timber roof beams are removed and reset into new houses. Bitumen and metals were melted and reformed or recast. Pigs recycle rubbish and all kinds of waste into meat. Animal dung is worked into mud plaster. It's used as fuel for fires and kilns. And even cuneiform tablets, perhaps especially school tablets like this one, were soaked, smoothed, and reused. So instances of Mesopotamian recycling and reuse range widely in their scale and motivation. Resource limitations or fuel scarcity may have pushed the recycling of materials such as metals, and expedience or sort of cutting out a manufacturing step may have motivated other activities such as tablet recycling. And connection with traditions underpinned the reuse of other objects such as seals. Now, the significance of reuse and recycling for cultural resilience is often cited, particularly within the context of regional resource clustering and scarcity. Now, maps such as this one usually show Mesopotamia as like completely devoid of all resources. There are Mesopotamian resources, of course, there's bitumen, there's fertile soil, animals, much, much more. But Mesopotamia does have limited hard resources such as wood, metals, and stone, which are in high demand by complex states. Resource imbalances led to the development of very strong and well-established trade routes. And although the region's inhabitants leveraged their fertile soil, efficient irrigation, and so on to generate surpluses to trade for hard resources, the demand for resources such as metal and stone, for example, was absolutely relentless and came from large institutions as well as the general population. The acquisition of new raw materials and manufacture of objects from sort of virgin resources was thus heavily supplemented by recycling and reuse. So the supply and demand of many resources were possibly only rarely equally balanced, due in part to the long distances and the time involved. So the supply chain may have been under frequent strain and increased stress, particularly in times of seasonal variation or climate change or political churn that reduced resource availability or disrupted access. So after that contextual setting, let's go to Nippur. And I'm going to introduce two examples of reuse from our recent excavations at Nippur earlier this year. As most of you know, Nippur is in southern Mesopotamia in the irrigation agriculture zone, and it is very well placed to interact with those strong regional trade networks. But despite the high demand for and fluctuating supply of hard resources, the reuse that we're going to look at is actually of products that were locally made of easily available local resources. So Nippur's patron deity, as you know, is Enlil, who's the most important god of the Mesopotamian pantheon for most of the 3rd millennium BCE. Even as other national gods replaced Enlil in the 2nd millennium, he continued to have significance and power in legitimizing kings thereafter, which in part explains the incredible longevity of the actual settlement there. In addition to the Temple of Enlil, it's Akur on the map, temples dedicated to Inanna, to Ninurta, and other major deities are scattered across the city. And these temples and their institutions and the economy that comes along with that, together with local administration, integrated agro-pastoralism in the region around, very strong and elaborate crafting systems, and firmly established neighborhoods with a strong sense of place, meant that Nippur is occupied more or less consistently from at least the 5th, possibly earlier, right through the 1st millennium BCE, albeit with some episodes of contraction, mainly due to climate change and political developments. So Nippur's long history of occupation involved the repair and expansion of public buildings, of houses, the digging of graves, trash pits, drains, minor canals in some areas, use of the city edge for mining mud brick material, and erosion of edge areas by rain. So all these practices and processes mean that its inhabitants would have had knowledge of earlier occupations and of the earlier versions of the buildings, pottery, tools, and other objects that they used themselves. So the Nippur project's current research focus is on the southern city edge, and this area was first occupied in the Ur-3 period, followed by contraction of the city and abandonment of this particular area in the Old Babylonian period. Then Kassite use, more contraction and abandonment, 1st millennium BCE use, probably during the Neo-Assyrian occupation of Babylonia or the early Neo-Babylonian period, but however way you want to label that time period politically, so either a late Neo-Assyrian or early Neo-Babylonian, essentially the 7th century BCE, and then a Parthian cemetery thereafter. But in each of these 3 main periods, a new city wall was built that encompassed this southern part of the site, which is at that point the city's maximum extent. And there were houses that were built inside the wall. So our research questions are really focusing on the 3rd to 1st millennium BCE neighborhoods in terms of their density, their demographic diversity, space use, and the urban economy as represented by these city edge zone activities and structures. But we've also recovered intriguing evidence for reuse that illuminates the inhabitants' choices and in some way their relationship with the past. So these are our excavation areas. I'm going to focus here on reuse within the southern group of these, WC5 and WC7. And as I said, the reuse developed at 2 different scales and in contrasting contexts. So small and portable in a domestic context versus monumental in a public, potentially royally commissioned context. So for the first reuse, the building that we excavated in these trenches was a very large 7th century BCE house. It's about 14 by 20 meters in area so far. It's actually significantly bigger. We've not actually reached the full extent yet. It has multiple rooms. There are a few subfloor graves and probably elite residence, as is suggested by things like incense burners, glazed pottery in the graves, and a wide-ranging diet, including some exotic wild animals that would probably not be accessible to a more underdeveloped population. Now, the plan of the house includes 2 pairs of rectangular rooms. So there's a living room and an unroofed courtyard. 2 pairs of them here is group 1 and group 2. That suggest potentially an extended family, possibly 2 brothers living together, or a father-son family pairing as well. Other than being quite large and having these sort of paired spaces, this is a fairly typical house for the region and the time period. It has mud brick walls, it has pretty normal room size, and so on. And within the house, from the occupational buildup in virtually all the rooms, there were literally dozens of these small circular discs made from sherds. Now, discs like this, made of sherds, are common in many contexts across the ancient Near East in many time periods, and they're generally identified as things like counters, game pieces, spindle whorls if they're pierced, which ours are not, sometimes tools for pottery production, burnishing, and so on, or lids. I want you to know that most of these are very small, so lids is probably not actually the explanation for this group. Anyway, so I've labeled this first set, and this is some more examples, type A, because we have some other examples of reused sherds we'll look at in a second. So this type has pretty normal planeware thickness. It's around 3/4 to 1 centimeter thick. They're not made of fine wares. They're not made of really coarse wares. It's just the kind of average pottery that you get that dominates the assemblage. The diameters do range from about 2 centimeters to 6 centimeters, but most are around 3 to 4 centimeters or less, unpierced. And most of these can't be dated. They're made in a generic, potentially 2nd or 1st millennium BCE fabric. There's quite a bit of chaff temper, but there's no diagnostic elements remaining on any of these. Right? So they could be made from roughly contemporary sort of 7th century sherds that have been broken relatively recently, or they could be from sherds that were broken many centuries earlier. There are a few discs from the other trenches further north that date to the Kassite period, and that's that group in the lower right, just to show you there's kind of consistency of this practice over time. There's also some other reused sherds. So this is my type B, which is very clearly made from the bases of the early Kassite period goblets, the ones that have the relatively hollow base to them. And sherds from earlier periods on the surface of Mesopotamian sites and settlements are incredibly common. Anyone who's ever walked over the surface of Nippur or other sites, you know there's sherds everywhere. Sherds are denser on the surface of abandoned sites, but they are visible even on occupied sites as well. And there is significant Kassite occupation in this southern city edge zone. So the Kassite sherds are out there readily available for reuse in the 17th century BC, just very, right outside the house. The third variant, which is type C, comes from the narrower, very solid-based late Kassite goblet. These are notably solid and extremely heavy. These goblet bases are particularly dense on the surface wherever there's Kassite occupation, and they are incredibly durable, which explains their ubiquity and their availability for reuse. A form I've called type D is similar in shape to these, but rather than the Kassite goblet that kind of flares out at the base or at the foot, these are kind of an inverse. So it's the stump or disc-based Kassite jar or cup that then flares out to the vessel body. And finally, we also have a few examples of this, type E, which is the chipped and ground base of just a random boulder jar. So I want you to contrast the kind of expected relatively jagged shape of like a normal bowl-based sherd that you would find on the upper left, which is kind of an irregular outline, versus the kind of rounded and smooth version on the upper right, and also these carefully sort of smooth and chipped and ground edges that this one has. Now, unlike metals or bitumen, we don't really expect pottery to be extensively reused in Mesopotamia. The raw materials for pottery are widely available. Clay is absolutely everywhere. Straw and other tempering materials are common. And even water is usually available, though it's kind of location restricted. Labor is relatively cheap. And from the 5th millennium BCE onward, craftspeople are well informed about the technology of pottery production. So knowledge, which is often an unseen part of the production equation, is also widely available. And broken pottery is used all over southern Mesopotamia. Here's an example from the 3rd millennium BCE for vertical pipe drain packing at Ur. Sherds were also used for repairs and even foundations at the base of walls, where mud brick can be undermined easily by wind and water. The durability and ubiquity of sherds, together with their sort of portability in bulk, it's easy to move around baskets of sherds and so on, potentially gives them affordances after Gibson in 1979, or clear possible uses. And I should stress that these affordances are theirs as sherds, not as the original vessels. But these examples, drain, packing, and repair, recycle sherds and treat sherds in the same way as stone or metals. And they make sherds effectively invisible by burying them. So this is recycling rather than reuse. What we're seeing at Nippur in the 7th century BCE is reuse of sherds to make new objects rather than the use of sherds as essentially a raw material. So I've dreamt up some potential functions for the new objects that are created from reused sherds as represented by each type. So discs, as I said, from the Neolithic and Chalcolithic in particular, are often identified as counters, little artifacts of administration, and the small size of type A, the tiny disc, agrees with this. For B, the main characteristic is their stability. So I've suggested maybe jar supports if you use them like a tripod. They could also be lids as well. Type C, which is from the solid foot calcite goblets, is extremely heavy, incredibly durable. And they could be weights, but not in the sense of weighing things in a pan balance, but more like weighting down cloth or weighting down mats against the wind. If anyone's worked in Mesopotamia, you know wind can be fierce as well. Or even hammers for hammering things because they're extremely durable. Type D, if you invert them, is very similar to B, so potentially the same kind of functions. And E could be a lid for larger vessels or some kind of expedient dish. Now, there are some gaps in these object biographies that I've identified. And the first is that there's an invisible step in the production of these objects, which is the selection of the ideal broken sherd that preceded the shaped sherd, disc, or base, or whatever it is. Those broken sherds must have presented Gibson's affordances to the inhabitants of Nippur, some kind of physical or morphological cues to their potential use or function. The second problem is that the affordances of these shaped objects are not actually transparent to us, standing outside the cultural context. I can dream up the etic functions in that previous slide, but these kinds of objects don't usually appear in texts. They're rarely found in their primary use contexts, meaning that the emic functions are very unclear. We also don't know, is there one main use, or were these objects made purposefully as multifunctional to be on hand when some problem presented itself, like counting sheep or playing a game or covering a storage jar? And the third issue is, why not start from scratch if a new pottery object is needed for one function or even a set of functions? Doesn't it make sense to purposely create something that matches that need perfectly? So the scarcity of fuel may be a weak link in the system of pottery supply and demand. We know it's they use date pits, dried reeds, animal dung, sometimes wood. The variety of fuel and its meaning for urban resilience, that's a completely different paper, but here its relevance is the limits on pottery production, and that's part of the framework within which these sherds are used. The frequent presence of durable calcite goblet bases at the site surface might have presented itself to the lazy as an opportunity to save labor and time, specifically the multiple steps and gathering of a variety of materials and tools that are needed for ceramic production. And finally, it's very easy for a potter to make a pottery disc or a stand by building out with wet clay, but this is not simple for a non-potter. But a non-potter can easily make these by carving down an existing sherd. In the production of many small items, a reductive process is much easier than an additive one. Reductive processes also have the advantage of slow carefulness, gradually creating a circle, removing rough edges. It's difficult to make a really big mistake while slow chipping something. So in the time I have left, we'll move out and look at an example of reuse at monumental scale. So just west of the house, we exposed a short section of the 7th century BCE city wall that's in the area circled in red. Coming in closer, you can see the western edge of the house outlined in blue, an alley, and then the city wall is on the left. Now, there are several internal structures within the city wall, and they're made in different materials and with varying brick sizes. So let's dig in and look at those a little closer. So the image on the left is the raw image, and on the right is a disaggregation of the various internal structures. So the eastern side of the city wall is an entirely new 7th century construction comprised of a pisé or possibly very packed together mud brick foundation, which is in the very light blue, and a mud brick wall above that in the slightly darker blue. That is connected via at least one perpendicular pisé cross wall to the parallel remains of the Kassite city wall, which is highlighted in green. So this creates at least 2 casemate spaces between the eastern and western walls. They're probably invisible from the outside once the actual sort of walls were built up. The total width of the city wall is at least 6 meters, probably 3 meters of Kassite wall, 1 meter of interior space, and about 2 meters of 7th century BCE walls. So how do we know that that green one, the western wall, is the Kassite city wall? Good question. It has distinctive and very regular courses and relatively small bricks, smaller than those that are actually the sort of bigger rectangular bricks in the 7th century wall. So you can see that in the detail in the lower right, just the kind of the arrangement of those bricks. And they very much match exactly both the brick sizes, the brick shapes, and the sort of very, very regular construction match exactly a much, much larger section of the city wall that we cleared further north in the WC4 and WC6 trenches that were in that set bit in the upper left. There, that wall is securely dated to the Kassite period by pottery. There was not a lot of evidence for the dating, I admit, in the WC7 area, but I think we're safe here, right? Now, unfortunately, in the further north area in WC4, the 7th century wall does not appear at all. It's probably completely eroded in that area. And one important point is that in none of these periods, and you can actually see that the Kassite city wall in WC4 is built right on top of the Ur-3 city wall, and it uses that as a foundation. So in the Ur-3 period, in the Kassite period, and in the 7th century BCE, in none of these periods is there a shortage of knowledge or a shortage of labor for making and laying bricks. There's not a scarcity of raw materials for making bricks, clay, and straw. It's still everywhere. So there's not an obvious economic reason for reuse of the Kassite wall in the 7th century. Now, these images show very, very approximately, I just threw these together yesterday, so they're not super perfect, but show the approximate line of the Kassite wall on the map on the lower right, and just you can get a sense of some of the distances involved. Now, symbolically, what happens is the 7th century BCE city wall followed a period of city contraction and neglect after the collapse of the Kassite kingdom. Reuse of the Kassite city wall in the 7th century BCE thus can be argued to be a rehabilitation of that gap, adjusting it from an apparent permanent city abandonment by the gods to a simple pause before reactivation and creating a useful fiction of unbroken continuity. City walls attest to the power of place. They also underline the power of the city edge, capturing space for the city, even if, as it appears here, this edge area was relatively sparsely occupied. So who commissioned the city wall? Well, possibly, potentially the Neo-Syrian king Ashurbanipal. There is no direct textual evidence that he built the city wall at Nippur, but he certainly built on the Enlil ziggurat there, as indicated by this inscription. And it's probable that other monumental structures at Nippur were commissioned at the same time, including secular monuments as well as religious ones, such as the city wall. Alternatively, the wall could have been built by one of the other Neo-Syrian kings who commissioned building works within Babylonia, such as Esarhaddon, or even by a local Babylonian leader leading the ultimate resistance of the Neo-Babylonian period. But whichever king is involved, and whether they are essentially foreign or a new local leader, the reuse of a pre-existing wall potentially prevented questions and attached the wall to a deep tradition of legitimate kings, as well as acknowledging the local sense of place. But with the same complexity of intentions as you get with things like Roman spolia, Assyrian reuse of the Kassite city wall may also suggest Assyrian conquest through completely incorporating and owning the earlier wall as well. So just to conclude, these examples of reuse at 2 scales underline that Mesopotamian objects and architecture have incredibly long and complex lives, and that reuse was not exceptional, but something that was basically normal. Reuse and recycling did not just engage resources coming from distant regions, but also objects that were made for entirely local resources. Reuse could be stimulated by expediency or efficiency, or it could be steeped in political meaning and linked to royal ideology. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Augusta, for the presentation. Thank